The United States is more politically divided than it's ever been before, and that division means that it can be nearly impossible to see eye to eye on anything across the aisle. One thing I think the vast majority of Americans can agree on, though, is that money plays an outsized role in our politics. And one way that money seriously sways political outcomes is through lobbying. Lobbying is technically protected under the First Amendment right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, and being able to speak to lawmakers and express opinions and desires for the direction of government is an essential part of a functioning, inclusive democracy. That's why it was written into the First Amendment. It's that important. However, we all know whose grievances tend to get the most attention in Washington. The people who are willing to spend the most money to sway our lawmakers. Lobbying has morphed into a game of which billion-dollar company is willing to spend the most to buy out our politicians. And everyone loses in this scenario, except for CEOs, shareholders, and the politicians who collect their money. Lobbyists on Capitol Hill are using their millions to influence our politicians and literally rewrite our laws, and it's mostly entirely legal. How did we get here, and why do we allow this, despite a long track record of abuse and bribery in the lobbying industry? This is why lobbying is ruining democracy. Roll the intro. The current state of the world can be a bit overwhelming. Believe me, I get it. I'm over here talking about it every day. To unwind after a long day, I like to cozy up on my big comfy couch with a hot cup of tea. And while I'm unwinding, I've been playing this cozy little mobile game called 𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏. It's a free to download mobile game that can be played on your phone or tablet. The premise of the game is that you need to come take over your mom's small town cafe, redecorate, rebuild, and create a thriving business by merging ingredients and serving customers. You get to bake apple pies without actually setting foot in the kitchen, and y'all know I love that. Plus, there's a little mystery involved when your mom goes missing and you slowly piece together the clues as you rebuild the cafe. Plus, you reconnect with your high school sweetheart and sparks fly, or do they? And there are always new seasonal events happening in the game, like a 2-week Halloween-themed event and an autumnal-themed picnic pass to keep things new and exciting. And I get to pick and choose how to update and decorate the cafe, which is fun, plus they have some new decorations for Halloween. Spooky. I love the strategy aspect of the game, like, okay, if I make this hot cocoa for that customer, how much space and how many moves will it take to make this apple pie for this customer? It takes a little skill and strategy to build a successful cozy cafe. I've seriously been playing this so much lately, and I hope that you'll join me and embrace the cozy season with 𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏. Download on iOS and Android for free using my link in the description. Lobbying has become an enormous component of the political landscape in Washington, in part because of the role money plays in politics and the cost associated with running for and maintaining elected office. An average senator must raise over $14,000 per day just to retain their office, and a candidate for the House needs upwards of $1.6 million to win a seat. Lobbyists recognize this pressure and are able to capitalize on it through well-connected, swanky fundraisers that are all above board and legal, but also make it very clear to elected officials who is helping them fund their position and what will happen to that money if those special interests aren't honored. I scratch your back, you scratch mine, you know? And boy howdy are those backs getting scratched. A recent study found that corporations that invest in lobbyists see an incredible return on investment in loosened or avoided regulations and taxes. A 76,000% return on investment, to be exact. For every dollar a corporation invests in lobbyists, they receive $760 back in the form of avoided regulations, tax breaks, and subsidies. And corporations aren't stingy with it either. In 2022, lobbying expenditures broke records with a total of $4.09 billion dedicated to influencing politics through lobbying. 86% of that money came from business, while ideological groups and labor organizations contributed 4% and 1.25% respectively. The health sector alone spent $733 million, with the finance, insurance, and real estate sector coming in second at $612 million. The biggest spender in 2022 was the National Association of Realtors at $81 million. Over half of the top 20 lobbying groups are related to the medical industry. The issues receiving the biggest amounts of lobbying dollars were federal budget and appropriations, health issues, taxes, and defense. And lawmakers of all stripes receive tons of lobbying money. The largest recipients in 2022 were Chuck Schumer and Kevin McCarthy. And it's not just domestic interests that play a role in lobbying in Washington. Foreign countries have pumped over $4 trillion into lobbying efforts in the US since 2016. The highest spender in 2022? China, at $62 million. And where does that money go? When it's not being spent on swanky dinners and fundraisers, it goes into lobbyists' pockets, mainly. Lobbyist salaries can easily top $500,000 per year, and the draw of eye-watering salaries has many experienced Washington staffers leaving lower-paying government jobs to use their connections and experience as newly minted lobbyists. And it's not just the staffers making the leap. There is a steady revolving door in Washington between Congress and lobbying firms. Fully half of retiring senators and a third of retiring House members make the transition from congressperson to lobbyists. Those who do receive on average a 1,452% pay increase. And this may have you wondering, okay, they make all this money and have all this influence, but what do lobbyists actually do? Well, I'm glad you asked. Lobbyists are professional advocates that are hired and paid by individuals and organizations to work to influence political decisions to the benefit of whoever hired them. Lobbyists can't pay politicians directly for votes. That's called bribery, and it is generally frowned upon unless it's done correctly. Then it's just lobbying. For example, a lobbyist for Big Pharma can't say, hey, Mr. Senator, if you vote down this bill that would lower drug prices, then I will pay you $50,000. Instead, a lobbyist can say, hey, Mr. Senator, we'd love to hold a major fundraiser for you. And separately, by the way, here are all the reasons why that bill lowering drug prices is bad for Big Pharma and bad for the economy and your constituents, etc. And then the lobbyist holds a giant fundraiser where Mr. Senator raises $50,000, knowing full well who made it happen and exactly what they want from him. That's just another day in Washington. Okay, so lobbying isn't so much about slinging cash around to make things happen as it is about knowing the right people and exacting the right amount of influence. This is why people who have previously held jobs in Washington are so valuable as lobbyists. They've been around long enough to know the right people. And the longer you're a lobbyist, the more valuable you become. Because it's not just about meeting congresspeople and schmoozing with them at fundraisers and cocktail hours. It's also about knowing who's who within the staff of each congressperson and who's actually pulling the strings. It's also about knowing people in other coalitions and organizations who may have common interests so that you can form a group that can more forcefully advocate for the interests of your client. And it's also about knowing the regulatory bodies that create regulations and working to make sure they pass regulations as favorable to your client as possible. And because most staffers in Congress and administrative agencies are extremely understaffed, lobbyists can come in as experts in whatever it is they're advocating for their client and provide congresspeople, agencies, and their staff with information on the facts, figures, and projected outcomes of upcoming regulations, legislative actions, and bills. This information is, of course, heavily skewed to favor their client, but our government doesn't have enough staff to fact-check it all, so they rely on lobbyists to gather that kind of information for them to help them make decisions on major bills. In fact, members of Congress frequently rely on lobbyists to help them draft legislation. Like, the actual words in our laws are often written by lobbyists, representing more likely than not the interests of big businesses. Lobbyists for an oil company largely wrote a bill about drilling for fossil fuels in an area where it had property. In a 2014 omnibus bill, Congress repealed a law that prevented taxpayer money from being used to bail out big banks. Who wrote the language in that omnibus bill that repealed that provision? Lobbyists for Citigroup, a bank that received a major government bailout during the 2008 financial crisis. Because lobbyists are able to show up in Washington as subject matter experts and fill in the gaps where Congress doesn't have the resources. A typical day in the life of a corporate lobbyist looks something like this. They awake with the sun, immediately checking their phones for the latest news that may be pertinent to their client's cause. If they find anything of particular interest, they may shoot a quick little email to a member of Congress so they're top of mind and keeping that member abreast of the latest developments related to their client. Then they head to Capitol Hill, where they may simply attempt to bump into members of Congress or their staffers to casually discuss the business of the day and rub elbows. And they will also attend congressional hearings, where they have further access to discussing issues pertinent to their clients with lawmakers and subtly shifting the conversation towards those interests. They may meet with lawmakers to present policy reports or even to assist with the drafting of statutory language. They may have their hands in virtually every part of the legislative process. In the evening, they'll attend fundraisers and receptions to further rub elbows and assist with the raising of funds for key figures. Our brave lobbyist likely works 40 to 80 hours per week, sometimes pulling all-nighters when key legislation is being drafted, making sure that their little fingies are in every piece of the legislative pie, and reminding lawmakers along the way who pays their way to re-election. Okay, so lobbying as it is practiced today, not as it was envisioned likely by our forefathers, is essentially legally sanctioned veiled bribery. It's the voice of big business, bolstered by millions of dollars, exercising its free speech rights by covertly greasing the right palms so the right bills get passed and struck down. But like I said, this is likely not exactly what the forefathers had in mind when they wanted to protect the people's rights to petition the government for grievances. So how did we get here? The term lobbyist has its roots in the lobbies or anterooms of British Parliament, where as early as the 1640s, citizens would gather in those lobbies to speak to their House of Commons representatives. This practice was carried over to the new United States. In 1792, Virginia's Revolutionary War veterans hired William Hull to advocate on their behalf for better compensation, marking one of America's earliest recorded instances of organized lobbying. In the early days of the United States, lobbying was treated with suspicion and often equated with corruption. An early example is a 1785 incident when Benjamin Franklin, after his tenure as a diplomat in France, received a diamond-encrusted snuff box from the French king. In Europe, the gift symbolized respect. However, in America, it was viewed with suspicion as a potential corruptive force. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had to approve any gifts from foreign officials, highlighting the nation's early concerns about undue influence. This attitude towards lobbying persisted throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. By the 1820s, lobbying had become synonymous with exerting political influence in the US. As the nation expanded post-Civil War, lobbying grew along with rapid industrialization and the rise of corporations. Newspapers of the time openly criticized the practice, with an 1869 column describing lobbyists as a dazzling reptile, this huge, scaly serpent that maneuvered its way through Congress. Courts in this era regularly refused to enforce lobbying contracts, deeming them contrary to public policy. One 19th century legal textbook even labeled such contracts void, arguing that they undermined basic principles of public integrity. Notably, lobbying was outright banned in certain jurisdictions. Georgia's 1877 Constitution declared it a crime, and for a period, lobbying was considered a felony in states like California. Despite these early reservations, lobbying persisted, often manifesting in overt acts of bribery. Samuel Colt, the famed firearm manufacturer, wasn't above passing out guns to legislators and their families to secure patent extensions in the 1850s. By the Gilded Age of the 1870s, the lobbying industry had fully entrenched itself, with figures like Sam Ward, the king of the lobby, throwing lavish dinners and influencing politicians. Ward would later be convicted of bribery. Lobbying's scope and impact further expanded post-Civil War, and especially during the Progressive Era, with an explosion in advocacy efforts both at the federal level and targeting state governments. Prior to World War II, lobbying largely went unchecked and loosely regulated. However, by the 1930s, the rising influence of the Nazi Party in Germany and growing alarm around communist infiltration in the United States set off alarm bells on Capitol Hill. To ward off Nazi propaganda, Congress enacted the Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1938, or FARA. Initially intended to counter Nazi influence, FARA demanded that foreign entities disclose any political or quasi-political affiliations with American politicians. While the act's original language targeted Nazi propaganda, it evolved over the years to address concerns about communist propaganda and later foreign economic competitors seeking to influence American politics. It also shifted from being purely an anti-propagandist tool to regulating grassroots lobbying by foreign agents. After World War II, further attention was paid to the issue of various interest groups influencing the legislative process. To stem this influence, Congress passed the Federal Regulation of Lobbying Act of 1946. The act required that any person or entity whose principal purpose was to influence legislative decisions had to register with the Clerk of the House and the Secretary of the Senate and file quarterly financial reports detailing their incomes, expenses, affiliations, and the specific legislative issues they were lobbying for or against. The idea being that a well-informed electorate could better hold their representatives accountable if they knew the nature and source of external pressures exerted upon their elected officials. However, the act had its fair share of criticisms and shortcomings. The language of the act, particularly the phrase principal purpose, led to ambiguity. it wasn't clear-cut as to who precisely had to register, leading to numerous exemptions and loopholes. For example, those who lobbied indirectly, or those who spent less than half their time in direct communication with actual members of Congress, could circumvent the Act's requirements. And those ambiguities and loopholes were reinforced in 1954 at the U.S. Supreme Court in the case United States v. Harris. In that case, the court narrowed the scope of the Act, asserting that it applied only to paid lobbyists who directly communicated with members of Congress on specific pending legislation. This meant that lobbyists who merely worked with congressional staff members, or those dealing with other congressional activities, were exempt from the Act's provisions. Additionally, the Act had no teeth. While it outlined the responsibilities of lobbyists to report, the onus for ensuring compliance was weak. The Clerk of the House and the Secretary of the Senate viewed their roles as more like repositories of the submitted information rather than as entities responsible for verifying the data's accuracy or completeness. And the Department of Justice, for its part, leaned towards fostering voluntary compliance rather than aggressive prosecution of violators, and this meant that people largely didn't comply with the law. The second half of the 20th century witnessed significant developments in the nature of corporate lobbying. During the 1950s and 60s, while political representation leaned towards the well-off, lobbying was relatively balanced. Labor unions played a pivotal role, and public interest groups emerging in the 1960s civil rights movements were influential. In fact, very few companies had dedicated Washington lobbyists before the 1970s. Those businesses that did engage in lobbying, typically through associations, were often deemed ineffective. But by the 1970s, businesses found themselves increasingly under regulatory scrutiny and began to mobilize against new regulations and policies that they perceived as hostile to business. This corporate frustration was expressed in the Powell Memorandum, penned by the soon-to-be Supreme Court Justice Lewis F. Powell Jr. in 1971. We talked about this memo in my video on Project 2025. It created the foundation for much of the new conservative movement. He emphasized the perceived marginalization of the American businessman in governmental decisions. This sentiment of marginalization tends to really rile up white men, so corporate America sprung into action. In 1972, amid an environment of growing regulatory costs and economic challenges, leading CEOs established the Business Roundtable, expressly to amass political influence. As a result, many corporations began hiring their first lobbyists, ushering in an era where they began to see significant political victories, from rolling back regulations to securing tax cuts. But it wasn't just about winning defensive battles. As corporations grew more adept and comfortable with the political landscape in the late 1980s and 90s, their approach to lobbying matured. Initially, they were hesitant about engaging with the government, but then corporations increasingly began to see Washington not just as a regulatory hurdle, but as a potential partner. Lobbyists began to sell the idea that a collaborative approach with the government could be profitable. This was a shift from defensive lobbying to a more proactive, collaborative approach. This, all the while the Federal Regulation of Lobbying Act, passed back in 1946, was doing very little to actually regulate lobbying in Washington. By 1991, a study by the U.S. General Accounting Office found that 10,000 of the 13,500 people and organizations listed as key players in influencing politics in a book titled Directory of Washington Representatives were not registered as lobbyists, and those who did register failed to properly fill out their paperwork. 60% of lobbyists reported no financial activity. 90% reported no expenditures for salaries, wages, fees, or commissions. 95% reported no public relations or advertising expenditures. And only 32% of filers reported a specific title or bill number of legislation lobbied. At the same time, in the early 90s, a scandal spurred further congressional action on lobbying. The scandal centered around a handful of legislators who had been lobbied by the 𝗫𝗏𝗪 Corporation, a company that failed to disclose its lobbying on required federal forms and outright bribed policy members to win government contracts. This brought to light the Wendell web of corruption and the general lack of any oversight into lobbying in Washington, which had grown from the 1940s into a behemoth spurred on by big business. The inquiry after this scandal resulted in the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995, or the LDA, which overhauled the Lobbying Act from 1946 by setting a clear definition of what counted as lobbying, which importantly included anyone who worked to lobby not just congresspeople, but their staff and agencies as well. The act also recognized both in-house lobbyists employed by businesses, as well as outside lobbyists who were contracted to represent clients. It also required further transparency with regards to foreign interests, requiring disclosure if a foreign entity held a significant stake in the client a lobbyist was representing. The LDA marked the first comprehensive reform of federal lobbying laws in 50 years and embodied calls for reform from academics and legislators alike. But the passage of the LDA, while a major overhaul, did not reform the established culture in Washington, where the line between lobbying and bribery has always been razor thin. Enter 𝗑𝗥𝗢𝗡𝗧𝗏, professional lobbyist who had been working with Native American tribes to lobby Congress and state officials for their benefit. The problem was that he lied to them about the prospects of the outcomes of his work, failed to disclose when his work failed, took their money under false pretenses, used it to buy lavish trips for himself and elected officials, and laundered the money through nonprofits. In 2006, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison after pleading guilty to mail fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to bribe public officials. The subsequent backlash and demand for reform led to the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act in 2007. This legislation, championed by Senator Harry Reid, mandated more frequent disclosure reports and placed stricter limitations on gifts to Congress members. Concurrently, the act made significant changes to campaign funding rules, most notably around bundled contributions from lobbyists. Bundled contributions, where individual donations are aggregated and presented as a collective sum, became subject to new disclosure requirements in a bid to increase transparency and curb undue influence. Then the 2008 financial crisis hit, and along with it came increased scrutiny and regulation of the housing and finance sectors. And you know what big businesses hate? Regulations. And since the 70s, they'd been fighting regulations with more and more lobbyists. This time around was no different. The Obama administration's efforts to overhaul financial regulations attracted a vast array of lobbyists, representing interests from banks to manufacturing companies. The influx of former governmental officials into the lobbying sector was a particular point of concern. As reported by the New York Times, financial firms on Wall Street employed over 125 ex-Congress members and their aides to influence the proposed changes, with the objective of limiting the oversight. This led to situations where former employees of agencies like the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Federal Reserve were lobbying their past colleagues. And so, despite increased regulations, lobbying in Washington continued to balloon, to the point where now more money is spent on lobbying than is spent on funding the House and Senate combined. Yes, more money is spent lobbying Congress than is spent on funding Congress itself. Today, major corporations can easily employ over 100 lobbyists, ensuring that they can be everywhere all the time. And as I've already said, the representation of lobbyists is heavily skewed in favor of big business, with 86% of lobbying dollars coming from the business sector. For every dollar labor unions and public interest groups spend on lobbying, large corporations and their associations spend $34. In addition to the unequal spending between business and other interests, which leads to the silencing of anyone who doesn't have millions of dollars to pay a lobbyist, there continues to be loopholes and relatively lax enforcement of lobbying laws today. Lobbying disclosure forms continue to be submitted with incomplete information. Corporations and other special interest groups frequently form associations to lobby on their behalf, and while the lobbying association itself has to file reports, the degree of separation means that these associations can spend millions on lobbying without actually clearly identifying the major interests financing the lobbying activities. The revolving door in Washington, where congresspeople go to work for major lobbying firms after leaving Congress, is a continuing problem. As 𝗑𝗥𝗢𝗡𝗧𝗏 himself said, "I would say when you're done working on the Hill, we'd very much like you to consider coming to work for us." The moment I said that, we owned them. Every request from our office, everything that we want, they are going to do. And then there's the Newt Gingrich problem. Which Newt Gingrich problem, you ask? Fair point. I'm talking about the problem where major players in Washington are able to take their clout and turn it into a consulting firm. They call themselves consultants, not lobbyists, and therefore don't have to register their activities publicly. Firms would pay up to $200,000 per year to become members of Gingrich's Center for Health Transformation, a consulting firm wherein members would gain access and connections to legislators at the state and federal levels, as well as endorsements from Gingrich himself. Gingrich and his aides insist that he never engaged in actual lobbying, and that appears to technically be true. He appears to have taken great lengths to toe the legal line between lobbying and consulting. But the very fact that he never actually ran afoul of lobbying laws shows their major flaw. Even if he didn't engage in the traditional work of a lobbyist, the fact of the matter is that his clients received unparalleled access to Capitol Hill that they would not have had otherwise, and Gingrich's presentations to legislators often featured favorable recommendations for services of his members, sometimes with without disclosing to legislators that he was being paid by those members. And Gingrich made a killing off of doing this, setting an example for future influential legislators to take the consultant route and sell access to Capitol Hill in ways that flout the traditional definition of lobbyist, despite having largely the same outcomes. The interests of big business gain outsized importance while everyone else falls by the wayside. Okay, so I hope I have painted a pretty clear picture. Lobbying, in theory, is important for democracy. We have a right to petition our government for a redress of grievances. We even have a right to organize so that our voices are unified when we petition the government for that redress of grievances. That is fundamental to the First Amendment and to a free democratic society generally. We like that. However, the reality of lobbying in the United States today has led to an absolutely overblown role for big business in politics, so that the voice of business is louder and more consequential than the voices of public interest groups and organized labor and individuals. These lobbyists have created an intricate and difficult web of networks in Washington to the point that you now need to hire a lobbyist with expertise if you want to have any influence at all in politics. Lobbyists beget more lobbyists. There is also a proven track record of bribery, scandal, palm greasing, and generally skeezy activity between lobbyists and lawmakers. This hurts everyone except for shareholders and CEOs and the lawmakers who take their veiled and oftentimes legal bribes. A number of proposals have been put forth by activist groups and lawmakers to try to address the rampant lobbying problem in this country. Here are a few. Prohibit combined lobbying and donations. Restrict the ability for individuals or entities to both lobby politicians and donate to politicians, ensuring that these activities are mutually exclusive. Address fundraising coordination. Implement laws that prevent lobbyists from coordinating any fundraising activities with political figures. Close the revolving door. Introduce stricter policies that create a waiting period for former public officials before they can become lobbyists to prevent potential conflicts of interest. Combat shadow lobbying. Ensure that those who engage in indirect lobbying or provide strategic advice related to lobbying, aka consultants, are still subject to registration and disclosure requirements. Regulate lobbying conduct. Move beyond just disclosure requirements by regulating the actual conduct of the lobbyists. This includes addressing concerns like family members of legislators becoming lobbyists, or lobbyists giving gifts to federal office holders. Address the significant percentages of lobbying disclosure forms that are inadequately completed and provide for stricter enforcement mechanisms. Include procurement lobbying. Include lobbying for government contracts as opposed to legislation, which is also known as procurement lobbying, within the regulations to combat potential corruption in this space. Differentiate public and private lobbying. Distinguish between lobbyists representing public bodies and those representing private entities. Monitoring public lobbying separately can offer better oversight of government spending on lobbying and allow for stricter regulations for private actors who drown out the voices of everyone else. Increase government capacity. Reduce reliance on lobbyists for information by providing more funding so that agencies and congresspeople have the personnel they need to make informed decisions about legislation without relying on lobbyists paid for by special interests. This could be done by developing a congressional clerkship program for law students or revamping congressional staff structures to retain more experienced and skilled individuals. Revisit the For the People Act of 2021. Congresspeople should consider the reintroduction or adaptation of provisions from the failed For the People Act of 2021, which aimed to overhaul the influence of dark money in politics and tighten regulations on indirect lobbying. And engage local movements. There is power of local anti-corruption movements, which can pilot reforms at the city or state level before they're adopted federally. These grassroots activities can lay the foundation for nationwide changes. Find a local lawmaker who champions the cause. In Minnesota, that's State Senator John Marty, for example. Reach out to them to get involved. Find local organizations that are working to restrict lobbying activities or campaign finance in your state and volunteer your time or donate. A Google search will do it. If you can't find one, start your own. Work on the local level can help facilitate movements. And also, share this video with your network. If you liked this video, you might also like my other video all about how money is ruining democracy. Thank you to my Patreon supporters, including my newest patrons, and also an extra special shout out to my multi-platinum patrons, Sophia Sams, Anthony Giles, and Brett Piontek. If you're interested in behind-the-scenes content, access to my research and notes, content about my dog, and all sorts of other stuff, consider joining me over on Patreon today. Also, I'm giving away 4 free books inspired by the videos I've released over the last month. This giveaway is for Patreon supporters only, and it ends tonight. So to enter, go to patreon.com/Leeja Miller. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye!